Well, joining me now is somebody who during the pandemic quickly became not just my go-to expert on trying to understand what's coming next with the pandemic, but he was easily the most, I think, trusted person I would book on Meet the Press during the pandemic. It's Dr. Michael Osterholm. I believe you're still at the University of Minnesota. Is that correct?
Still here doing the same thing, slugging away.
Except you are leaving your studio. There was a time you didn't leave your house for quite some time, right?
Actually, I'm here right now.
But you did. You have left. You've
Oh
gone
yeah,
back.
I've left. I'm out. I'm out and about. Yeah.
You have a new book out with your co-author, Mark Olshaker. It's called The Big One. I'll hold it up for the camera. And in some ways, in the tagline being how we must prepare for future deadly pandemics. And on one hand, I'd sit here and say, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from COVID. I can't wait for the government after action report of what we're going to do better next time. And we're still waiting for that. The one big thing that struck me about this book is, are American leaders ready for it? Meaning, are they ready to actually tackle the preparation part, or are we still too hungover, frankly, from what we went through in 2020 and 2021?
Well, let me just start out by saying that when you think about preparing for the big one, that seems miles and miles and miles away before we even get to that, because we're having such a problem preparing for the immediate one. Mm-hmm. And what we're watching is basically the destruction of the public health system, unlike anything I've seen in my 50 years in the business. And so today, I mean, imagine this, all the leadership right now at the CDC, all the executive office are appointed political individuals. They're all appointed, no scientific expertise whatsoever. Imagine if you had an aircraft carrier and the top 12 people and that aircraft carrier command were all just appointed politically individuals. How confident would you be in that? And so I think, Chuck, we surely want to talk about the long term because it's inevitable. Right. We're going to have that. But I think we have to also recognize, even in the short term right now, we're in big trouble.
Well, but it also sort of opens up, the book implies we haven't had the big one. What was COVID?
Well, first of all, let me just kind of put into perspective what a pandemic is in the sense of what we saw with COVID or what we saw with flu. Prior to COVID, we really thought that the only virus that was capable of basically changing itself and then infecting people around the world in a very effective way was influenza. Mm-hmm. We had warning signs that COVID could do this, or a coronavirus at least. And in fact, in the book that Mark and I published in 2017, Deadliest Enemies, Our War Against Killer Germs, the actual chapter on coronavirus was a harbinger of things to come. Yeah. And so that when we saw what happened with COVID, we shouldn't be surprised what else could happen. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, when SARS showed up in 2003, remember that was a coronavirus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And I actually worked on that because at that time I was still spending 50% of my time at the Department of Health and Human Services following 9/11. And we saw a virus that was not that infectious. A couple of individuals were super spreaders, but basically we were able to contain that. But about 15 to 20% of the people who got SARS died. Well, then 2012 came along, and we now had MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. It started on the Arabian Peninsula. And again, I was involved with that investigation as a advisor to the royal family in the United Arab Emirates. There, we saw a virus that's the same way in terms of transmission. Wasn't that infectious with some individuals that were indeed super spreaders, but we could contain that. But now up to 35% of the people died who got that infection. With COVID, we had about 1.5% of the people who got infected died. And today, we now have actually documented coronaviruses in the wild that actually have the onboard capability of being transmitted as infectious as COVID was, but also have on board the genetic package to kill at the same levels we saw SARS and MERS. Now imagine that combination. Instead of 1.5% of the people dying, we're now talking 15, 20%. And even in our book, we even hypothesized just what would it be like at 7.5% deaths among those who got sick. And so you can see these really are realistic concerns, and they may seem so frightening that we can't do anything about them, but we can do a lot about them.
It was interesting. So what you're saying is that this coronavirus that we did experience at a 1.5% death rate doesn't qualify it to be the big one?
Oh, not at all. Not even close. And or an influenza virus like 1918. That too would have killed many, many more people if it were to even happen today. And so that we have to recognize, we could have another COVID-like event, but we could have ones that would be much, much more severe. And this isn't movie making. This isn't, some kind of scary scenario. These are the realities of what we are dealing with these viruses today.
So much of your work before let me ask you this. How much of your work before 2020 was about the virus itself and the science behind it, and less about the sort of the psychology of the public and how it would react to it? You get where I'm going here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't say how much was about the psychology of the public, although I surely was very concerned about that. I wrote an interesting piece back in 2005 when H5N1 first showed up. And I was able to get the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, and Science all on the same day to publish the same article that I wrote, so that it was coordinated, calling into question how prepared we were for a future pandemic, and basically laid out all the reasons why we weren't.
And didn't you frame that somewhat in bioterrorism? At the time, because it was 9/11.
It wasn't even in 2005. It wasn't even bioterrorism yet. Although I surely have talked a lot about the role that bioterrorism could play, and we're very at risk for that very scenario today too.
Right.
But the point of it is that we know that these viruses are going to change. Pandemics are inevitable. As I say, the pandemic clock is ticking. We just don't know what time it is. And people may say, well, we just got through a pandemic. We won't have one for a while.
Right. It's like a hurricane. Is it pandemic season, Michael? Right.
Yeah. Like a hurricane. We just got hit by a hurricane, so we won't get hit for another 20 or 30 years. Go ask some of the people in the southern United States about that. Okay. Yeah. And so I think that's the challenge we have today, is helping people understand, one, they are going to happen. Two, they could be a hell of a lot worse than we've already had.
Before we get to more on your book, because it really does, if it seems to me you should be busy leading an after action report that is, some sort of joint House, Senate, executive branch. We didn't do it. And I understand I know why our politics haven't allowed for this to happen, but how much are we just, if I want to prepare for this one, I need to be understanding better what we could have done differently. And did we overreact in some places, underreact in others? If you were charged with this after action report, how would you be focusing your scholarship?
Well, first of all, it's really important to emphasize that we do have examples for how after action reports can be such important tools for preparing for a future event or even preventing it. For example, I had the good fortune after 9/11 to spend 3 years as a 50% consultant at the Department of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, and was able to get in on the early days of the bipartisan commission on 9/11. And I watched an event unfold there where it was nonpartisan with incredibly good leadership.
This was Tom Kean and Hamilton?
Exactly.
Lee Hamilton? Yeah.
Lee Hamilton.
Just two high-class guys.
Yeah. And you know what? There were a lot of challenges identified, real deficiencies, but nobody pointed fingers. What they did is they added them up. They said, what can we do about them? How are we going to deal with them? And you know what? We did a lot that came out of that after report. Well, now what we have is it's all boiled down to one simple question. We just want to know, why did you lie about Wuhan? And I talk about that in the book and say, we're never going to know whether that virus leaked from the lab or whether it was a spillover. I tend to still personally favor, I think it was a spillover.
I was just going to say, I'm an Occam's razor guy. Like, when the story came out that they found this virus in a remote part of the country, it's like, oh, they were trying to study it. It slipped out. I mean, it feels like, what's the most logical reason? Because why would the Chinese want to inflict something that they didn't have a cure for?
Exactly. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the point being here, though, is that we have to get off of that. I keep saying there is so much we can do. And
well, our friend Dr. Fauci would say that it doesn't matter what the origin story is in this specific incident, because we've got to focus on preparation regardless.
We got to, we need to prepare for both. And, at the very outset, let me just say that this book really has two flavors to it that I don't think are very apparent necessarily. One, it's a love story, and it's a love story to my grandkids, because I sit here and say, oh my God, what kind of world might you experience in the future that we could really do something about? The second thing is, I am an optimist at heart. I really believe that we can achieve tremendously important game-changing vaccines in the upcoming years with a really concentrated effort at research, that we could have the vaccines available before the pandemic begins, that could be readily deployed, could be highly effective. And if that were the case, we could take pandemics off the table. But we're not doing anything to get there. And that, I think, is the real challenge, is that it'd be different if we had nothing to do. We don't know what to do. It's inevitable. We can't stop hurricanes, okay? But in this case, we could stop future pandemics dead in their tracks.
Well, let's talk about that. Because this is, by the way, when you were writing your book, did you assume that a Kennedy-like figure would purge the CDC the way it's been purged? Or did you write this book assuming we wouldn't have something that drastic happen?
Well, let's put it this way. It was on the cusp of the intersection of the two. I wrote a piece in November in the New York Times in which I said, my God, world, wake up. This man is going to take our vaccines from us. Okay. Right. Go back and look at that piece. Predicted pretty much everything he was going to do has been done. So and we were just finishing the book at that point. So we were able to get a little bit of that into the concluding chapters, but I have all recognized from the very beginning that he was going to basically destroy public health. Did I have the idea that he would do it as effectively and as quickly as he did? No, I didn't. But I think it's really today the biggest challenge public health has faced in 50 years.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.
It's funny. I equated, I'm curious of what you think of this metaphor. I equated this sort of surge of anti-vax views to what happened. It is not a coincidence now in hindsight, after watching how we behaved during COVID and after COVID as a society, to now realize, the pandemic happens in 1918, and literally a year later, we're banning alcohol for the next decade. And we sort of lose our minds as a society. And within a decade, realize, wait a minute, we're actually killing more people with bootleg alcohol. This is crazy. We just created a criminal syndicates that didn't exist before, thanks to bootlegging, right? Is it possible we're in the middle of just sort of losing our minds post-pandemic here? So is the anti-vax movement similar to the sort of temperance prohibition movement in that it's always was out there, but it needed a moment to get traction, and COVID was the moment?
Well, I think you're right. In fact, while we saw the anti-vax activity well before COVID, even 10 years ago it started. But in fact, the whole manifestation we see now really, I think, did come off of COVID. And I've explained this with the idea that it really is a metaphor for what all the people who thought that the pandemic response was a total failure, if not really a punishment in of itself, now have equated those feelings to the vaccine. Remember, the vaccine initially was heralded as President Trump's great accomplishment, and everybody thought this was going to be end all of the pandemic. Well, we didn't do a good job explaining that part, that it was not going to be, but it was still going to have a major impact. And then when basically the pandemic began to end and no one could complain about what was happening in terms of mandates and things like that, they still needed a way to be angry about it. And so it became the vaccine. And so today, so much, I think, of what is aimed at anti-vaccine overall did come from COVID. And it came from this idea, it's like out of network, I'm really damn mad about everything. And
Right.
so I'm going to be mad.
And I'm just going to be mad.
Yeah.
So if we're in a world where the government can't lead on public health, how do you prepare for the next big one?
Well, let me give you an example of what I think is just such an apparent mistake right now that's happening. Our current capacity to make influenza vaccine, which is a good vaccine, not a great one. It doesn't stop you from getting infected. It doesn't stop you from even necessarily getting sick, but it has a lot to do with preventing you from having serious illness, hospitalizations, and death, which I'll take any day of the week as an outcome. If we were to have to make an influenza vaccine overnight for an emerging pandemic, using the egg-based approach we do for growing the virus, this is an embryoed chicken egg, or a little bit of cell culture, we could make enough vaccine in the first year to 15 months to only vaccinate about a quarter of the world. That's it. mRNA technology, which of course was very important in the COVID response, actually could change that substantially. And in this case, what we're talking about is a vaccine that still is good, not great. We want even better vaccines, but we could make enough COVID vaccine for flu to vaccinate the world likely in the first year. The difference between those two scenarios is literally millions and millions of deaths, millions of deaths. And yet we just ended a $500 million investment in trying to make sure that we had the technology available and ready to go to make a COVID/influenza mRNA vaccine. And why? Why did we do that? Because it was about ideology. It wasn't about the real science.
Yeah, the Kennedy never produces science to back up his gut feelings. There's never even like bad scientific research. There's none.
It's beyond description of what this is. And I have to tell you, last Thursday and Friday, the Advisory Committee Immunization Practices met at CDC. This was the advisory group to the CDC.
Have you ever been on that group?
I have not. I have not.
I was curious if you've ever served.
I've advised it for a number of years. But the bottom line is that I have seen high school student council meetings held with more decorum, practice, and effectiveness than I saw at that meeting last week.
Wait, but the pharmacist said that she knew 4 different people who'd gotten a vaccine and something bad happened to them.
Yeah, I know. It was.
I'm sorry. That was like really set me off. Like,
what
the hell are we doing?
Well,
we literally have just some random pharmacist who may or may not be well trained. I mean, no, there are good pharmacists out there. Don't get me wrong. You have to go through real training. But what do they know about the making of these things?
They don't. And I think what was really more telling is you have somebody who's an expert in supply chain management out of the business world telling us all about the immunology of mRNA vaccine technology and had no idea what he was talking about. And yet that came across as that. But it was more important. I mean, we actually had an example. I can't make this stuff up, where one of the members on a hot mic moment said, "What did we just vote for? What was it?" I mean, he didn't even know what they voted for. I mean, that was emblematic of the entire 2-day meeting.
What is it? They voted against recommending the vaccine, but they're not going to force a prescription for it.
Well, for the chickenpox and MMR vaccine combination, we've known about this for years and have made recommendations. Instead of having the combined vaccine for the first dose, give the varicella or the chickenpox vaccine separate from the MMR. And therefore you don't have febrile seizures, these things that basically are benign, but it's hard for a parent to see. But that means you're going to get an extra stick, and only then make it available for the second dose where we don't see that phenomenon at all. Well, they voted to take away the ability to use the single vaccine for the young kids, but then they took a vote to have the Vaccine for Children's program pay for it, which seemed a little inconsistent. Okay.
Right.
So they had to come back the next day and re-vote to undo the vote they did the day before. Again, you can't make this stuff up.
No, I mean, Keystone Cops doesn't even work as a good description there. So let's go back to, if we don't have a government essentially getting, I mean, this move to mRNA vaccines and this technology, I mean, and the stuff it's doing in cancer treatments and this, I mean, to think that we have just pulled all this funding. I mean, it feels like it's as if we said, you know what, this whole electricity thing, let's go back to candles. I mean, where does this research go? Is it all going to be dispersed in universities? And or are we going to just have less and less of this research and hope that the French and the Koreans have more success?
Well, let me just paint a very quick landscape picture of what's happening simultaneously, because it's not additive. It's really, in a sense, multiplicative in terms of impact. You know, we destroyed basically our ability on an international level to be part of anything as it relates to infectious disease issue. We pulled out of the WHO.
World Health. Okay.
We destroyed USAID. We destroyed PEPFAR. One of the most important programs that this country has ever done in terms of soft diplomacy, you know, bringing the very best of this country to low and middle income countries, where now we see 30 million individuals who are HIV infected who will likely die in the immediate years ahead because we no longer can get them drug treatment. Okay. Pennies a day we were spending on this program. We now no longer have contact with the world to understand, for example, what is really happening with Ebola in the Congo. What's going on in Africa. And we have an outbreak right now in DRC that is of real importance. And so we're totally out of the picture internationally. And, you know, we controlled a lot of infectious diseases over there, so it didn't even get to our border. Now we have to understand our border is going to keep getting hit day after day with these infectious diseases because we're not stopping them on a global basis.
No, the tariffs will help. No, anyway,
okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
You know more about that.
I'm trying a little bit of tariff humor. I guess it didn't work, but anyway, go ahead.
I hear you. So first of all, that's the first issue. The second issue is that, you know, again, I mentioned it earlier. Right now, there is not one single senior scientist in a leadership position at CDC. Do you know, for the first time in decades, we no longer have anyone in the White House that has any biopreparedness expertise? Nobody in the National Security Council. These used to be major activities where basically they were air traffic control for our federal response. In fact,
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Bush team and the Obama team together and did a pandemic simulation.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And I did Obama, in fact, even do that with Team Trump in the first term, I think. Anyway, there's these.
They did.
I think
and let
they
me just
did.
say that Team Trump in the first administration actually had a very comprehensive and I think really quite credible plan that just has been thrown away. It's got
Dr. Osterholm, I mean, look, I think not enough credit is given to Reince Priebus and Mike Pence. They built the first Trump administration, and you know they've gotten a lot of grief from the mainstream world and some. I think in hindsight, they did a lot of they put in a lot of guardrails that held up for a term that were very important.
And you know, Chuck, you know, you've worked with me for long enough to know, you know, I have served in formal roles with every administration since Ronald Reagan.
You're about as apolitical of a person that I know. Period.
I am, you know, and you know, I served 2 Republican governors, 2 Democratic governors, 1 independent wrestler here in Minnesota, you know, in terms of at the state health department. And yeah, you know, my job is just to be a member of the public health army to fight these things. So my comments are not at all partisan, but what we're seeing happen right now is one that is not about partisan. It's about destroying the very infrastructure that got us the benefits that we have so enjoyed in this country. And we're going to see a number of diseases come back that we thought we had gotten rid of, and we're not.
I have this sneaking suspicion that we've got quite a few doctors, family doctors, who will not recognize mumps or measles at first because it's been so long since they've been in circulation that doctors may not be able to diagnose what a child has because of this.
Well, you know, just this past week, it's been noted that Chagas disease, a type of parasitic disease transmitted by a bug called the kissing bug, because it tends to go to your face when you're sleeping at night and bite you, and it actually causes potentially very severe heart disease. The vast majority of doctors in this country couldn't tell you what Chagas disease was, let alone diagnose a case.
Mhm.
And that's all coming in now from the southern border. We now have at least 12 states in which this bug is commonly found. 15, 20 years ago, we would never have talked about this. So do I think this is because of the breakdown in public health? Not necessarily, but the challenges that we're seeing globally is growing immensely. And I think so when I talk about the problems of today, there are problems that would have happened anyway, but we're making them a lot worse. And of course, we're doing nothing, as we talk about in the book, to prepare us for tomorrow.
Well, and some of the things you talk about in here are sort of some, I don't know if I would call them lifestyle change. I guess I would call them architectural changes, right? Where it comes to how do you improve airflow and how do you like some preventative things to at least slow the spread of a deadly virus. Go through some of them, because are these things we can do without the government?
Yeah. Well, let me just first of all say that, and you know me well enough also, this is not merely trying to gain favor with the moderator here, but you, as I've shared with you in the past, are one of the few media people that really understood what you were asking and what you were talking about. And, I can remember one episode on Meet the Press with you where I said I thought the darkest days of the pandemic were still ahead of us. People like Nate Silver and others just nailed me for that. Here I was scary again. Over half the deaths in the pandemic occurred after that moment.
Right.
It wasn't at the end. And I think one of the things that we failed to do was have that kind of creative imagination, understand what would this look like for 3 or more years. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post in early March of 2020 saying, do not do lockdowns. They won't work. Don't do them. And it was all about the fact that, are we prepared to do that for the next 2 to 3 years? This is not like a hurricane where it's going to blow through and do incredible damage in 18 hours, and then we go into recovery. We were going to have surge after surge of these cases, and we had to be prepared for that. And so what we proposed, and again, just to address the question you asked, what can we do? A process like snow days, because in fact, the one thing that we could do to save lives was to have good medical care. And when your hospital's at 140% capacity, you don't have health care, period, let alone good health care. And so what we should have done is, instead of having these lockdowns, which, by the way, have been grossly overstated what they were.
Right.
We had 41 states that had some information out about minimizing contact for a period of 2 months, basically from end of March till end of June. By June, they were all over with. A state like Minnesota had basically a stay-at-home order, except for essential workers.
Well, you know what I chalk this up to, Michael? I'll chalk it up to the fact that D.C. and New York were probably the most small C conservative metro areas in the country in what was closed and what was open. And because that's where 90% of the media people lived, and I think it got an outsized, because everywhere else, it was sort of what I would call sensible lockdown, right? Which was, everybody else did it within sort of common sense. This New York City and Washington, D.C. were just sort of more elevated than other places. And I think it had an impact on the coverage.
I think you're absolutely right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And what we had proposed was do snow days. What does that mean? If we could let every person know every day what our hospital census was for our hospitals and our community, and if we got to 90, 95%, please, for the next 2 weeks, back off public.
We're not going to work from home. Let's try to work from home. Let's do a few this,
Schools may be closed temporarily, and then get that number back down so that if you do get sick, you can get good medical care, because that's all we can really offer.
And the more important thing is as we learned, we all learned there was COVID seasons. Plural, meaning right? It was the summer was peak in the South, the winter was peak in the North, right? We had all these different, so it wasn't we've learned that it wasn't one set of rules to fit all. Different regions were had different capacities and different surges.
Right. And that's what we needed to get across, is we're going to be in this for the long haul. And so we had to find a way. An example of what the lockdown world really was, if you did it as we thought we did, would be what happened in China. They actually had major areas of China that were truly locked down, where people literally had food delivered to their homes. They didn't leave their homes for months and months. Well, without vaccinating that crowd, finally the social pressures got so great that they basically relaxed these lockdowns there. And guess what? Millions of Chinese died later in the pandemic, not earlier, because once they were no longer in lockdown, they basically had it. So as I've said multiple times, whether you died the first 6 months, the second 6 months, the third 6 months, or the fourth 6 months, you were pretty much dead at the end of the pandemic. And so our job was to get us through 3 years of what was going to happen and anticipate that. And we didn't do that. And that by itself would be a lesson for the future of how do we approach this. Don't do lockdowns. Talk about managing that, maximize medical care so it's available.
No, I mean, in some ways, COVID came right when the technology gave us the opportunity to actually not shut off our economy at the same time.
It did. And I think that a good example of that was vaccines. You know, I've also wrote about this and also talked about this with my colleagues often, and again, was not always necessarily seen as the person we wanted to invite to the party. But I had indicated early on, 94, 96% protection in those first 2 months, which was the data that we had from those vaccine trials, was remarkable. But we know about coronaviruses. They tend to have waning immunity over time. And we've seen that multiple examples with the cold causing coronaviruses. So I had actually said, how about every month we put a number out for this cohort and we follow up and say it's 94% today. Next month it's 88%. The following month it's 72%. And you guess what? We're going to need boosters. But you'll know the number. We'll tell you. Imagine if we had done that, than having people assume that when they got their 2 doses, it was done and over with.
No, that for the life of me, you know, I went back and racked my brain on this, and I really guess we got to blame the politicians, because I feel like we were all careful in reporting, hey, look, this vaccine is about preventing death, not preventing the virus, not preventing symptoms. You are going to get a cold. You know, it just isn't going to be as harsh, and it isn't going to kill you, and this is what it's for. But you know, I mean, this is where the absolutism, right, of our political conversation created the illusion that the virus was going to make people immune from COVID. And boy, this is where it's obvious our information ecosystem was already broken by the time of 2020, because mainstream reporting never was saying that or even implying it. Only a few politicians were.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's exactly the point. So again, preparing for the future, how do we prepare the news media as well as the public to understand messaging and what that means? And I think that by itself, if we just had that, so if the things we just talked about, if we could actually dramatically improve our vaccine capability, which we can do if we just have dedicated funds, instead of one aircraft carrier, and I'm not a defense expert, so I'm not here to bash DOD or DOW, I guess, you know, that alone could get us the technology for this. And again, what's happened is not only have we taken the mRNA vaccines off the table, but there's one of Mr. Kennedy's key people, who is now the head of the NIH, who has made a decision to put $500 million into an influenza vaccine that we've proven over the past 4 decades doesn't work well. You know, what's that about? But if we could change that, if we could talk about the things that we just did about how do you keep people from staying out of the hospital? You know, how do we convey messaging in a way that isn't about lockdowns or not lockdowns? We could have, I think, come through this in a very different way.
Right. There's almost like a very sort of dry way of doing this, almost like like you would if this were a department in the military. Okay, this is how we will prepare for this battle. And we're going to have data on this, and we'll have data on this, and we're going to have our hospitalization data trigger when we do school shutdowns. And this, I mean, all that that's perfectly logical what you're laying out here, and exactly what people do expect government to be capable of. And Kennedy is just, he's the virus right now, unfortunately.
In fact, let me just add a piece to that, because I think you and I actually discussed this on the air several years ago, was the issue of school kids. You know, early on, there was this conclusion that this virus was really not that damaging to kids. You know, they weren't seeing the same number of deaths per, number of people infected, et cetera. And in the first year of the pandemic, 199 kids in this country died from COVID. And there were a number of studies that came out saying, see, look at this is not a big risk compared to what we're seeing. But then when the new variants, the Delta and Omicron variants showed up, that changed. And in fact, there were 612 deaths the second year, and there were almost 800 deaths the third year. 87% of the deaths in kids occurred in year 2 and 3. Yet we were operating by the rules of what was year 1. And to get that message out, to say, wait a minute, we got to look at this a little carefully now. There was a wonderful study done in the Boston area, basically looking at kids in the most comprehensive study to date. About 80% of the transmission in year 2 and 3 in households occurred because of a child bringing the virus home from school.
Right.
And we didn't adjust to that. That's the other thing we have to do, is have situational awareness to say, this is what it was then. Didn't tell you something wrong, but now look what's happened.
You know, we treat science, and this is I guess I would put this in the larger political community, and I throw the press in there in this. What you're describing is we treat science like it's a politician who declares a position on an issue, and then when they try to change their position, we call them a flip-flopper. Well, in the world of science, right, what the data says on year 1 is not necessarily going to be the data, because, you know, nothing is permanent in the world of science, right? There's always, and our lizard brains, right, our political lizard brain can't seem to convey that it's normal for the science to change. It's not unusual for the science to change. And that seemed to be a huge barrier in conveying information to the public.
You know, Chuck, the one thing I try to instill in all my graduate students, science is not truth. Science is the pursuit of truth. And that means you need to be humble. You need to be able to say, well, look what we learned now. Look how that changes. Exactly what you're saying. We need to have a much more open culture to that idea that science is the pursuit of truth.
Yeah. So, for instance, you know, all of a sudden now, I can't help my brain behaving in the following way. Bobby Kennedy Jr. is going to come out and say that Tylenol it might be a cause of autism, and I say might, right? And it is going to be. I don't want to say it's junk science yet, but at the same time, you know, it doesn't feel like there's enough to be as declarative as that they might be on this. At the same time, I'm well aware that things we thought that were healthy, we'll find out one day that they're not, right? So how would you be conveying this acetaminophen situation in a more responsible way?
Well, the first problem we have is that people have a horrible time understanding risk-benefit. Virtually nothing in this world is risk-free, and often has benefits.
I love playing the risk game. You know, somebody says 95%. I said, would you get on an airplane that had a 95% chance of landing? And you start to think about it. All right, how about 90%? And then it's like, nope, 1 in 10, I wouldn't do it, right? Like, you know, people it all depends on what the risk is. I'm a big fan of playing that game because it's a way of teaching people, what does it 95% really mean?
Absolutely. Well, if you look at acetaminophen, actually one of the other real challenges in pregnant women is actually fevers. And, you know, I'm not an expert as an OB/GYN on this issue, but acetaminophen has been a very important part of reducing fevers and the issue that raises with potential.
My wife had migraines, and during the pregnancies, she couldn't take her migraine medicine. So it was just Tylenol. I mean, that was all she was allowed to take. And it only kind of worked.
And so let's just start out with the fact that we have to understand risk benefit with this. Second of all, as you pointed out, there's still a lot of questions about just what the role of Tylenol might be and how much does it account for? Is it a few percent of all the cases that occur? And realizing the data we have to date is very incomplete, and we're going to learn a lot more. You know how many times I say to myself every day, boy, I wish I know today what I'm going to know 6 months from now.
Of course.
You know, wouldn't I be a lot better off?
Be a great gambler.
I think, you know, once we better understand this risk of acetaminophen, my own personal belief is it'll account for a very, very small part of the autism picture. In the meantime, we're going to throw out a very important medication from a fever standpoint that in pregnancy is in itself a challenge.
Well, half the population is going to accept the premise here.
They do. They absolutely do. Although I will have to say, when red wine was in vogue, everybody went with it. When it wasn't in vogue health-wise, I'm not sure everybody stopped. That one they kept.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. When it fits your lifestyle, red wine's healthy for you. really, it's just sort of less unhealthy than the other stuff is probably the better way it should have been described.
Yeah, that's right.
So when somebody who's listening to us here is going to hear this acetaminophen, I mean, is it going to impact your view of acetaminophen?
Well, I first of all will tell you that one of the important things is you don't want to have armchair quarterbacks like me who know enough to be dangerous to be commenting on this. I've already been contacted this morning by a number of news outlets asking if I'll be on today to comment on this. And my answer is I don't know enough. And therefore, I'm not the voice you want to have. These are the people that from the OBGYN world that can really give you better information. So I'm going to beg off this one and say that I know enough here to say that it's not a slam dunk, but at the same time, it's one we have to look at. But like you, I worry that it'll be misinterpreted and that we're going to see damage occur because people aren't taking acetaminophen when they should.
Look, the biggest fear I've had about this entire experiment that we're on right now in this current political environment is that we already had half the country sort of anti-expert, okay? And now they took over the expertise lane, and now we're going to have the other half of the country no longer believe experts. And I have a friend of mine who used to tell this joke. He goes, if the beer companies behaved like politicians, Miller Lite says it's less filling, but what they don't tell you is that this is in there. He says eventually it's not that people would stop drinking Miller Lite or stop drinking Bud Light. They'd just stop drinking beer. And I think the fear we have here is that everybody's just going to not trust anything they hear, which is honestly, I understand if they would come to that conclusion, given the situation we're all living in.
I think you're right. And I think that's the challenge we have trying to get ready for the big one, because the first one is nobody wants to believe it can happen. It won't happen. Nobody wanted in 2017 when I published Deadliest Enemies and talked about what I had 3 chapters in that book that pretty much played out as the pandemic did, except I used an influenza virus. And I think that that's the challenge, is how do you get people to understand this is what you can do about the future now? And I worry that that's going to get buried in, well, everything's a screwed up mess. Let's do nothing.
Right. No, and that's so obviously the big thing you'd be standing up is sort of this preventative virus and vaccine research, right? Which is what we had going at NIH. It was an amazing program. Now it's gone.
It's absolutely critical that we globally do that. I mean, as I said, I lay out.
If we don't do it, who is? Who is doing it? Is it France?
No, this is one of the problems, is the U.S. is the tail that wags the dog. In fact, I would say the tail that wags the elephant.
I had an EU ambassador say this. He goes, if I could replicate one thing America does, he says it would be BARDA.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, and so from that perspective, I'm very concerned that we're going to see on a global basis countries not willing to get an mRNA technology, because if the U.S. isn't leading the way on that, or they're anti-mRNA vaccine technology, there's no market in it for them. And so we're already seeing companies on a global basis pull out of mRNA research. And as you noted earlier, this is not just about COVID or influenza. This is about a whole number of other infectious diseases. The one I just mentioned.
Can you imagine a vaccine for cancer? For certain cancers?
And that's real. Right.
Right.
And those vaccines are both prevention, but more importantly, they're also treatment issues. I mean, we can actually use these vaccines for very effective treatment. And again, it was a situation where the statements that were made at the ACIP meeting last week, they were so off base. They had no basis in science whatsoever, but they were stated with this authoritative voice. Look at how bad these vaccines are. Look what they do to you. And that's the challenge we have.
So that gets starved. All right. So if we can't, what would, besides standing up the mRNA research, what else should we be doing in preparation for the big one? I mean, obviously, we learned a lot about PPE and what we had too much outsourced and our reliance on other countries. That I think we're getting. At a minimum, that's probably something, at least in the short term, that even this administration wants to get right.
Right. But unfortunately, I'll tell you right now that we're not any better off with manufacturing capacity or what to do. But let me back up. In the book, we cover this. we saw so much mis and disinformation, and public health was really in part to blame for this, because we basically kept saying, a group of us said it's not airborne, meaning these very fine mist-like particles that fill an entire room, rather than the droplets, those things that basically, if you've ever been in the front row of a play or a concert, you see those droplets coming out across the stage, okay? Those are the ones that people said were causing this. That's the kind of thing that hygiene theater was all about. The plexiglass and all of that made no difference whatsoever. Bandanas made no difference. Surgical, you needed to have what we call an N95 respirator. Why did that work? Because first of all, it was very tight face fit. You know, how many times you ever use swim goggles that leak through the glass? They did. They leaked through the sides. The second thing, though, is it wasn't just any material in front of your face, because something that's airtight around your face, you'd suffocate quickly if you couldn't move air back and forth. And so this material had an electrostatic charge to it that basically trapped the virus coming through, but let air come through. Well, but they still were very uncomfortable for many people. And we talk about this in the book, we need a major project to develop a consumer-friendly, reusable N95 respirator that people would wear and actually find it to be comfortable, and one that they would wear into public. You know, if you could do that, you could stop a lot of transmission for people that had to be in the public setting. You know, it was hard to watch so many families in this country where grandpa and grandma, mom and dad, the kids all lived in the same apartment. You know, you couldn't isolate these people from each other. So if the kid brought a virus home from school, grandpa and grandma could have died from it. That's where this kind of increased respiratory protection could make just a huge difference. But we're doing very little to achieve that right now.
What about in our the public setting, in building codes and things like this? Are there things we should be doing differently in order to essentially be more to help us deal with a airborne virus?
Well, first of all, let me just say that we already have an example of what can be done with building codes. And look at the earthquake-prone areas. Look at the hurricane-prone areas. You know, we actually tailor building codes to meet those challenges. Well, we never really thought about air. I mean, we all talk about safe water supplies. You know, we want to make sure our food is safe. But when's the last time you heard somebody say, how safe is our air? And so one of the things we need to do is just understand that that is also a very important way for virus to be transmitted. You'll appreciate this one. I use as an example of what airborne viruses are like. In a previous life at the state health department here as a state epidemiologist, I led an investigation of measles that occurred in our state associated with the Special Olympics. The International Special Olympics were here. And on opening night session in the Hubert Humphrey Metrodome, 65,000 people in the stands, we had the entire infield and outfield field filled with all of the players from the different countries and their coaches, etc. Well, the A's by alphabet country were on right at home plate, and that was Argentina. And we had a young boy who was just incubating measles, was infectious, and the outbreak resulted in the entire participant group. But we had many people in that 65,000 plus visitors that night who had no other contact with the Special Olympics. They also had an outbreak of measles. Nobody knew each other, but it turned out they all sat in the same section in the far, far right field upper bleachers where Mark McGuire at the time couldn't hit a home run in steroids, 420 feet away. And it turned out that the air came out from behind home plate, across home plate, and bounced and literally went all the way up to that right field outtake vent up there. And everyone who was in that section who had not previously had measles got measles that night from that exposure. Wow. Now, that's how dynamic airborne transmission is. So how do we improve ventilation there? And that's where we have to do a lot of work. We don't have easy answers. It's not simple, just turn on a fan. But this, again, should be a very basic research area that we're doing very little with.
It's funny you used the measles example there, since it was something you were involved with. I have an older relative who's wondered aloud, if measles is going to be back in circulation, are there boosters that older folks probably never thought they needed but may need? Are we gonna,
Yeah.
what kind of, how concerned should we be for our population over the age of 50, for instance, when it comes to a new outbreak of measles?
Well, in keeping with my science is not truth, it's a pursuit of truth. I'll tell you, but what data we do have is the fact that it says you probably have lifelong protection.
Okay.
That's why measles, mumps, and rubella, that vaccine, is easy for me to talk about mandating it because one, it stops transmission. It stops you from getting infected, and it's lifelong protection. And this is where you then contribute.
No boosters necessary on that
one?
It
doesn't look like it at this point. We'll continue to follow it. I could be back on here tomorrow and say, well, now we have data. If you're immune compromised at 60, you may need a booster. But the bottom line is, this is one of those examples of a vaccine that is so good that it is putting rods in the reaction. You stop community transmission when you, in fact,
but let's be humble here. What we don't know, we didn't know we were going to reintroduce measles into the population. So there's going to be a whole new slew of people over the age of 60 who even 50 years ago, our elderly population was just not as big because we didn't keep people. Right now, people live longer. We're going to learn. Okay, what does lifelong protection mean? Is lifelong 60 or is lifelong 80? Right? And that's again, as you point out, we got to keep pursuing this.
And we do. And the one thing I would say that's in our favor, 60 years ago, we still had a lot of measles around. Okay. So you may have gotten vaccinated and then gotten an unrecognized boost by having been exposed to the virus and then only reinforced your protection. Where I worry about is more in the 40-year-olds, where in fact there were a number of them that never were exposed to measles because by the time 40 years ago, we were really starting to improve on this. Let me just point out, I had never seen congenital measles in my life until this recent year. Congenital measles occurs when a young pregnant woman gets infected with measles while pregnant. Okay. Well, why did we not see that before? Because prior to vaccination, virtually everybody under age 20 had already had measles.
So it was a herd immunity, right?
Herd immunity. Then after that period, even in the transition years of where we saw a vaccine, there was enough people that did get vaccinated that we just didn't see sustained measles. Now we've got enough measles circulating with 20 and 25-year-olds who have never had measles vaccine or who never had measles itself, who are now getting infected while pregnant. This is a new phenomenon because of the unique nature of what you were just describing of, what happens with time and how does time change things.
Would you take your grandkids to Disney World right now?
Well, right now I might, because there's very little evidence of measles down there beyond what we're seeing anywhere in the country.
Yeah, well, Florida's about to go anti-vax.
I know that in the future, and I've said this, I wouldn't take them in the future. I think that's a huge issue. And of course, the other thing that's happening here.
By the way, as an aside, I suspect that at some point, the people that own theme parks in Orlando are going to put real pressure on government, because this is going to have a huge business hit. You're going to have more and more people not coming because of this.
Well, let me add on to that, if I could pile on.
Yeah.
Right now, almost 5,000 kids in Canada have had measles this year. Remember, we're talking about 2,500 to 3,000 cases here. But remember, they only have 40 million people population. We have 340.
So that per capita is something else. Jesus.
And Europe is even worse.
Yeah.
Well, how many kids are going to Disney World right now from Canada or from Europe? And so these theme parks are even becoming a greater risk issue, because not only is it the United States contributing to it, but all these foreign-born individuals where we're seeing these huge outbreaks of measles around the world. And so this is a global issue. What are we doing to deal with it on a global basis? Very little. We're pulling out of the WHO.
I do want to land this plane, because we can go doom and gloom for quite some time, but I got to ask about H5N1, right? Where we are on that, and the concern that it can, it hasn't jumped to humans, and that's thank goodness.
Well, let me just say,
this is the bird flu.
We're going to have another influenza pandemic. There's no question about that. Will it be H5N1? Well, a year and a half ago, when it first showed up in dairy cattle, I was very conservative and said, I'm not sure this is going to do it. And people looked at me like, what do you mean? This is your baby, a pandemic. Well, I said, you know what? I've been involved with this since 2003 when it reemerged in Asia after the 1997 outbreak in Hong Kong. I was actually in Indonesia, Malaysia, working on this, okay? And we all thought, this is it, this coming any day.
Yeah.
I watched it go through the next 10 years and actually caused very limited problems over time. It dropped and dropped. And then I was on the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity in the US, the group that was supposed to oversee research safety in our country. And we had two very important researchers come to our group and said, we're one mutation away from H5N1 causing the next pandemic. Oh my, nothing happened. 2015-16, we had a major outbreak in the Nile River Valley, 140 some deaths. Then it disappeared, nothing happened. Now we're here with the dairy cattle. I don't know what it's going to do. Anyone that can tell you what H5N1 is going to do, good luck. But I will tell you, there will be another flu virus that will emerge. So we need to be prepared for it.
And is it still, the uncomfortable relationship with China? I mean, is China still it feels like Asia is the place where this incubates more. Is that true, or is that just perception?
Well, I think it's true to the extent that it should show up anywhere. I mean, look at 2009 H1N1 showed up in the pork industry in central Mexico. It showed up in the pigs there. Could occur anywhere. But one of the things we have to understand is, for example, today, the fastest conversion of energy to protein is poultry. And so globally, we're producing more poultry than ever before to feed our 8 billion people. Bushmeat has become much more commonly consumed in parts of Africa, Asia, etc., that never before happened. Now people are being exposed to that. So there's a lot of opportunity for exposure. We just recently recovered a virus from a bat cave in China that is like the one I talked about with COVID on steroids, one that had the infectiousness and the ability to kill. That was isolated from a bat. And so I think, it's still there. It's still going to happen. I just, like I said, the pandemic clock is ticking. I just don't know what time it is, but I know there's a lot we can do.
And it sounds like we should be thinking about vaccinating some of our, the animals that are part of our food supply.
Absolutely. And that is surely on the table now. That was a big trade issue because they didn't want to have to acknowledge that they had vaccinated proof of it, and the U.S. really opposed it. I think that's changing because the wild bird migratory season moves this virus so quickly. So many operations have been hit hard with H5, both dairy and birds. And so I think you're going to see more of that. Absolutely.
And you don't view bioterrorism or naturally occurring pandemics as sort of any differently, do you? Like the preparation is in your mind, the preparation should be identical.
I had the opportunity recently to have dinner with a group of former senior intelligence people from the United States, people really on the cutting edge and stay there. And they'll tell you that we've never been at more risk for a bioterrorism event as we are now because of everything that's been torn down.
I completely agree. I'm really worried about that.
And countries know this. Other countries know this.
Of course they
do. If we had a major event today, the CDC sure couldn't respond. Nobody in HHS could respond. Maybe DOD could have some response, but how's that going to go? And it would be a real disaster. And again, I want to emphasize the Trump 1 administration had very detailed, comprehensive plans for that. And so it's not a partisan issue. It's just that this administration has elected to throw them out.
No. Well, look, the book is the big one. And yes, it is a little bit, it's a little bit scary, Michael.
Well, I just tried to tell the truth, and I did that. You saw how many times.
That's why you were always the best guest to have, but it was direct. I mean, I do think in some ways we tried so hard, everybody tried so hard to it's something I did in the past, which I call rounding the edges, because you want to make everybody feel a little bit better. And ultimately, you just got to be matter of fact.
Yep.
Particularly when it comes to science.
Chuck, you've always done that. And I so appreciate you for that. And I hope you continue to have that voice. It's important.
I appreciate you saying that. And I'm glad you're out there warning people. I really hope somebody currently at HHS is reading and is seeing this stuff. That's, I'm never going to give up hope that there are people in positions of responsibility who won't eventually do the right thing.
I'm with you.
Because that like you can't 100% give up on somebody because you never know when they might be your ally.
Yeah, and again, I have hope because I have to have it because of my grandkids.
Well,
I'm going to have it.
If you don't have hope, what's the point?
That's right.
To get really dark, right? And so, we're going to have it. Michael Osterholm, is always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's a great honor to be with you. Thank you very much.